Hi, from Dr. Kate. We've reached what is one of my favorite parts of the semester, probably because I use this methodology most frequently in the types of work I do, and that is the creation of surveys. The first task at hand for everyone is for you to go to our campus homepage and type in that little search box the word Qualtrics. Qualtrics is something that we purchased that everyone can use in order to create their own surveys. You've probably heard of things like SurveyMonkey. It's like that, but better. All of us, if we have a UWW ID, we can go into Qualtrics and create our own accounts. So that's what I'd like you to do right away, and just so that you have it. What you don't want to do is instead Google Qualtrics and sign up for a free account. People have made that mistake in the past despite my telling them not to, and the problem will be later because if you sign up for a free account, they will not let you extract or take the data that you collected, which is exactly what we need to do. So again, go into the web page for homepage for our campus and sign yourselves up now for a Qualtrics account that we can then work with as we go into our group projects soon. I select this as what you should use for your major group project of the semester because I think we can get this done as efficiently as possible in the time that we have available to us in just our few short weeks. There are different ways to conduct surveys, cross-sectionally or longitudinally. A cross-sectional design means that you're going to just go survey some population once. So sometimes people like to think of this as cutting an apple in half and you take a look at the section. That's a cross-sectional design, as opposed to longitudinal, where you are able to, and this is going to take more time, money, and energy, you're going to survey people multiple points in time. So you might take a baseline, an initial reading, so to speak, of your population, follow up with them at 30 days, maybe after 6 months, and whatever your design happens to be. But regardless of if you're using a cross-sectional or longitudinal survey, when researchers use these approaches, they're assuming their sample isn't skewed, that your sample is representative of some population that you're interested in. Now, while we are going to do cross-sectional, one point in time, I just call it a one-shot wonder as a researcher, fields like psychology or health communication or public relations, they often will use that longitudinal approach to see, do any kind of changes in people's attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors, are they sustainable over time, which is why you would use that approach. Now we've gone through the different types of data we can collect multiple times already this semester, the first being nominal data. This is just categorical. Often the ways that we collect certain kinds of demographics are nominal data, like race, ethnicity, like what type of job you might have, things like that, that don't have a hierarchy to them. So here's an example of one that you might see when you're filling out a survey. They're just going to tell you to check all that apply and what kinds of products have you searched for online. We try to avoid that other that you can see at the bottom as much as we can because people will tend to write in things that we're not interested in, but we will get more into that later. But these categories are nominal because it's just names, it's just types of products. We're not saying one's any better than the other, it's just by name only information. Just to give you a brief example of how knowing this cross-sectional versus longitudinal might apply is when I was doing my doctoral level training and my own dissertation, which I'll talk about in more detail at a later date, but it was with the injection drug user population. I was just actually gathering other people's articles, studies, reports, and all I was looking for as data was, did they have change data or comparison data? So that might help you to understand this a little more fully. For a cross-sectional design, the studies I was looking at would have two different groups of people to make comparisons with. So they tended to be people who went to NEPs, which is needle exchange programs, and those who did not. That's a comparison. Or they would take a look at folks who went to needle exchange programs and see if they had behavior and attitude changes over some period of time. Most of the things I look at would take baseline, meaning your initial data that you would gather, and then do some kind of a follow-up, usually 6 months later, and see what happens with their risk behaviors like needle sharing over time. If, though, articles I read didn't have any of that kind of information in it, that's just called descriptive data or a descriptive study. So I can't use that in the kinds of analyses I was doing, and it's not like there isn't value to that, but it is just one point in time without any way to look at comparing to another population or taking a look over time at changes. Let's take a look here at an example of a survey that may have been taken before the Obama election. The first thing to pay attention to is when was the survey taken, the point in time, because that does matter quite a bit to the likelihood of people actually saying they intend to vote, as well as who they intend to vote for. Now, I don't know about you, but prior to elections, I get a lot of requests for participation in brief surveys on my intention to vote. A lot of the times I won't answer the call, and or if I do, I refuse to be part of it. And even sometimes if I agree, I might give an inaccurate answer just for the heck of it. Call me crazy. I'm not sure why, but that's another problem with surveys, the veracity of the data, the truthfulness. So let's say we did get a sample of people intending to vote in a general election for president. And we had 45% of those we surveyed stating they intended to vote for Obama. We're going to mention here a term called standard deviation. Standard deviation is a statistical calculation that is looking at how close to accurate are the result. So 45%, if we say there is one standard deviation, that means that we are 68% sure that the actual result for intention to vote for Obama is somewhere between 44 and 46%. And if you want to replay this part to make sure you understand, feel free to do so. So think about this. 45% is the number that gets reported through social media or popular press or what have you. If, and it's going to be in small print, if the standard deviation is 1.0, then we are 68% certain that the result within this population that was surveyed is actually between 44 and 46%. Now, that's not particularly good, but for us in social science, we tend to accept that. And that's why there's always error. They'll call it SE or standard error in the data that we have. But let's say we want to up our certainty to 2% or to 2 standard deviations. That would mean we're now 95% sure that the result is between 43 and 47%. So we widen the range to be surer, which should logically make sense to you. The more sure you want to be, the less accurate we can pinpoint the result. And that's what we're talking about. But let's say we just want to know for sure how many people intended to vote for Obama. Well, the only thing we can say with 100% certainty is that between nobody and everybody intended to vote for Obama, which is, as I say here, absolutely useless information. Now, during that general election, Mitt Romney was actually predicted to win, and there were some explanations for that. There are things called statistical modeling that brighter statisticians than myself are into to figure out what variables can they put into the computer and how accurately can we make predictions on what's going to happen in our future. Again, think of science explaining, predicting, and controlling as the goals. So there were inaccuracies. What were the inaccuracies? There was underestimation of the number of Hispanics and African Americans who would be voting in the general election in 2012. And because those voters from that particular demographic voted much more heavily for Obama than Romney, that's why we got the result that we did. Now you might be saying, why aren't we just trying to be more accurate? Well, the more accurate you want to be, the more it's going to cost you. The more accurate you want to be, the more people you need to sample. And that is why we're doing sampling, so that we can ask as few people as possible to get the best result that we can get. But always recognize, and remember this for your future, that these polls that are taken all have error within them. Now let's take a little bit more of a look at longitudinal research. Temporal ordering means in time, which comes first, second, third, and so on. If you do longitudinal research, it can help you figure out that temporal ordering because you are going to look at things rather than one point in time at multiple points in time. You can see I have the word effect in quotes because we really are never able to say something affects something else in human behavior with 100% certainty. because there's just too many variables involved in human behavior. So we're looking at results, pinpointing variables that have an impact. We could then say in an inference, this may be a cause and effect type relationship, but not like it is in the hard sciences. So we can never prove this with absolute certainty that doing one thing leads to another in the world of human behavior. But longitudinal research can help us put things in, at least in a time order, which is helpful to extend the body of knowledge and research. So, types of questions. We know nominal, ordinal, interval, ratio. And we're going to go through what that would look like in a survey. Demographic information can be nominal or other categories as well. So let's take a look at age. If you ask for what's your age in years, that's what I mean by asking for raw number. And that's ratio level data because it has a meaningful zero. You might have seen in surveys people asking you to check a box what category you're in, like an age of ranges. So for you, it might be 18 to 25. That might be what the category is that would be fitting for you. That is, instead of ratio level data, we've now changed that and we're actually in ordinal data. So there's a hierarchy. So let's say you see a possibility of, we're giving this survey to adults, so everyone has to at least be 18. So we've got an age range of 18 to 25, 26 to 34, 35 to 50, 51 to 65, and over 65. Doing that in that way rather than asking for just simply how old are you in a number, raw number, is going to lessen the impact of that data. And what I mean by that is having data like that is going to limit what you can do with that data later because you want to analyze the data. Mentioned more than once about gender. It's a nominal variable in that the values are typically male, female, but we have definitely expanded that. And there's even question about how to ask this. Should you ask, what is your sexual identity? Because for some, there is a distinction between what you identify as versus what you were born, or at least what you were told you were born as, and in your DNA. So beyond just saying male, female, of course, we have many more categories that we can select from: cisgender and bisexual, transsexual, and so on. How many categories do we need? Or do we put male, female, and an other category and ask those taking the survey to write in a response or type it in? Education is a difficult variable, though it seems like it shouldn't be. Depending on your population you're asking, you could say, what is the highest degree you have obtained? And then you'll probably have a category less than high school, which means you didn't really have a degree of any sort. A GED, high school diploma, so on and so on. So how much information do you really need from that? Do you want less than high school, more than high school? Is that enough? Now that's going to depend on your group that you're surveying. Let's say you're doing something in a corporate setting and you want more clarification. such as if they have an associate's degree versus a bachelor's degree versus a master's degree or some other kind of advanced degree or professional degree. Again, there's not a single answer for this because it depends on what your goal is with asking that kind of a question. I've had fantastic failures with years of schooling because people just don't calculate it like I would calculate it. So even for people that have a high school diploma, if I said instead how many years of schooling you had, a lot of times folks will give me instead of like 12 years, which is what to me is common sense with a high school degree, 12 years of schooling. They're going to count kindergarten and pre-K and such, and they might tell me they have 14 or 15 years of schooling. And for me, that would really translate more to now you've got at least some college education. So those are the problems with the construction and design of surveys, that you're getting the information you need. Race ethnicity is another difficult area because, for one, there is an increasing population that is biracial in the United States. So how do you get at that? One way I suppose you could ask, similar to gender, is with which race do you most identify? And have them indicate Caucasian, etc., etc. Now, if you do it that way and just allow for one choice, that's probably going to give you cleaner data than asking, check all that apply for your race ethnicity, because you may get some combinations, let's say Native American Asian, the people checking multiple boxes, and then really how many people would you have in that category? Probably very few, and then you end up tossing it or just collapsing together. So perhaps your largest categories are African American, Caucasian, Hispanic, which is actually an ethnicity, not race, and then this other category, which is however everyone else answered. You kind of throw them together to make a new category. So the more options you give people, the more likely I think it is that you're going to have messy data. Oftentimes, the income question comes up, and people are, for whatever reason, very, very sensitive to admitting their own income. What is it they make? So instead, to counteract that, researchers usually will say your gross household income in, let's say, now we'd say 2018. Do you want to get the exact number, or do you want to put these income levels, making them ranges instead? Most times people favor the ranges. So under 20,000, 20,000 to 30,000, 30,000 to, and so on. But again, the caution for this is that you lose a lot of information when you put things into ranges or categories of an interval level rather than just knowing what the answer is. What was your household's gross income for the year 2018? You can ask all sorts of questions. It's going to be very easy to build and overbuild your surveys when you start doing this. Is religion a necessary question? I was called out on this when I was a postdoctoral fellow with my mentor. He said, why in the world would you care, somebody's Lutheran or what have you, for my injection drug users? And I made some argument about spirituality. Maybe that would come into play. And he poo-pooed me and told me to get rid of it. And that was a lesson learned. Because I can ask it doesn't mean I should ask it. Household can mean different things. Do you want to get some sort of a reading of the makeup of the household? So is it a single parent family, etc.? Are you instead looking at how many people besides yourself, or including yourself, depending on how you want to word the question, how many people are in your household? Are you interested in, through this category, the type of housing? Are you renting? Are you owning your own home, or whatever other variations there can be? Those are all things that can fall under housing questions that may or may not be relevant. And again, don't ask if you don't have to. Geographic area could be important. What's your zip code? That's a common way to ask that for categorization purposes. Another separate area are psychographics. And think of psychographics as lifestyle characteristics. And here's examples of psychographics, different kinds of activities, hobbies that you participate in. Maybe on campus we could have, intramural, intramural, being on, sanctioned teams on campus. All of those could be kinds of questions if you think that's important to your topic area. Sports interests that you may have, different kinds of shopping habits, frequency of online versus in-store purchasing, what kinds of organizations or clubs you are involved in, civic organizations, service organizations, for us, perhaps academic related organizations, and so on. I'm just giving other examples. Could be, gaming's a big thing these days, psychographics on social media usage and media usage, and so on. Those are psychographics. So we've gone through nominal. We'll talk again about ordinal level data. Anything that has levels or ranges to them is ordinal level data. I did a survey a few years back now related to the ALS Ice Bucket challenge, and asking, how often do you make charitable donations? So you could ask it as ordinal level data, saying from never to, you've probably seen these kind of questions, 1 to 2 times, 3 to 5, more than 5. It gives you information, but it's kind of weak information. Other examples of ordinal level data would be your rank in a company, which I give you examples here, or other kinds of things that you can rank order of characteristics. Though all of that is ordinal level data. So what are some of the goods and bads about survey research? Let's go through a few. In cross-sectional survey research, the advantages of this are as listed here. Taking information from people at one point in time, normally pretty adjacent or close to when something has occurred, is probably more accurate. That the longer away from a given point in time, the less accurate people are. Doing things cross-sectionally is going to be less expensive, much easier and faster to conduct your study if you're just sticking to a one point in time kind of a technique. And surveys, let's say you're working with a business like a nonprofit, which I have done quite a few times. It's also a good way to have a relationship established with these folks for potential future use. Maybe you'll want to run an intervention to be a type of an experiment later. Getting data and doing a good job with that for such a company might help pave the way for you later. So my number one rule, the garbage in, garbage out, is simply asking crappy questions gives you crappy answers or data. So we have to be really careful of what we're constructing, how we're constructing it, because once it's out there, like our internet-based surveys, you can't get it back. And if you asked in a way that will give you bad data, nothing you can do about it other than scrap the whole project and start over again. I've gone through some other possibilities of rules that I call in quotes. Get the best data you can whenever possible. If you want raw data, ask for it in raw data form. If you want number of times somebody does something, ask it in that way. Don't give them just ranges, like from 0 to 1 to 5 times, 6 to 10 times. That data asked in that way is not going to be as valuable. Other kinds of rules for surveys: don't ask questions you don't need the answers to, like religion as an example I gave earlier. What else? Pre-test your survey always. Even before you launch it with potential respondents, have other people look at it for clarity, not just yourself. It's easy to make mistakes because you read things into your wording of questions and so on. There's many so-called rules of survey design, like make it as short as possible, but long enough that you get the information you need. Certainly you want, if you're going to create the survey and want to get measures, that you use valid and reliable survey items that others have created. And on the flip side, you're not changing around questions that others have used in their scales and then thinking that's okay, because it's not. And we'll talk more about that at a later point. So interval level data is where we get into the world of the Likert type scales. And just to refresh your memory, that means that each point of the scale, let's say it's 5 points, that if you circled number 1, that it's equal distance from number 2, 2 to number 3, 3 to number 4, and 4 to number 5. And why do we care about that? As social science researchers, we care because we're making that assumption in order to do some kinds of statistical analyses that are stronger than others. That's why we say that. And that's what I say here, equidistant. That's what I mean. The points are equidistant from each other. These are commonly used to measure attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and particularly, though, behavioral intent on a certain number of point scale. Agree, disagree is a very common one to use. This type of data is better data for analysis later than having nominal or ordinal data. This kind of data, let's say you ask a bunch of agree, disagree questions that are from someone's valid and reliable scale, and then you add them up and you get a measure of something. You can use that score or measure of, let's again say self-esteem, and then take a look at how does gender relate to self-esteem scale and a bunch of other variables that you've collected demographically and otherwise. Forced choice means that you are going to have an even number on one side and the other. So we Have as an example, disagree, slightly agree, and agree. There are a lot of people out there that like forced choice because it's saying you got to take a stand one way or the other on whatever the topic is. I personally use a midpoint, which would be neither agree nor disagree, because I think that's often the case, that we don't have any big strong opinion one way or the other on something, that therefore making people choose a side that they in reality don't have in their heads is artificial. So I use that. Others would argue not to use that. But you're with me, so that's what we're going to use. As we move on here, I'm showing you possibilities of a 5 or even a 7-point scale, which then, because it has an odd number, means there's going to be a midpoint. That midpoint might be labeled in surveys that you've seen as neutral or no opinion. I tend to say neither agree nor disagree as how I label that central point. And again, the beauty, if you will, of creating these kinds of questions is that you can tally or add up the responses in order to get some kind of a score. Maybe it's a knowledge test, maybe it's a behavioral intent, some kind of an attitude or psychological characteristic that you are using, often someone else's scale that's been designed and is valid and reliable. You throw it into your survey and follow their directions of how to score. And again, we have here the example of that the equidistant assumption that we make with Likert type scales allows us to do a lot of things that we can't do otherwise. I mentioned the term semantic differential scale in the first portion of our course. So just as a refresher, this is where you're going to design your survey to cover different concepts. So often people like to talk about Facebook or social media when designing surveys for our class projects. You might want, in this case, to have part of your survey be having just the topic area, Facebook, for the folks to take a look at, but underneath it, there's going to be a series of items or questions that have opposites. That's what a bipolar pair of adjectives means. So for Facebook, you might say easy and hard. You might say expensive, inexpensive, popular, unpopular, and so on down the line. So you're going to have like a batch of these. They'll have 5 or 7 points, and people just make a check, click on how much they believe it to be hard versus easy. So along that 5 or 7 points. They won't know it's points on a scale, but you may have even done these yourself in the past, and that's a semantic differential scale. One thing we have to make sure of in either doing Likert type agree disagree items or these semantic differential scales is that we don't have everything worded the same way so that all the directions go in the same way. So what I mean by that is for a semantic differential scale, you wouldn't just have like all positive characteristics on the right-hand side and all negative characteristics on the left-hand side, because people may just tend to go right down the line and check everything on the far right side without really reading it. And that's how you can later figure out if you have to get rid of some of these surveys because they don't really make logical sense. If they think something's positive on everything, but then they go on that right-hand side, but you throw in a few negatives on that side as well, and they check everything consistently down the line. That's an inconsistency that you have to question. Same as going agree, disagree. If all your statements are in the positive, people might just go agree, 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 agree. And then later, you're like, I wonder if they actually read the questions. If instead you word some negatively so that if they did like whatever the product is or whatever you're measuring, and we're seeing some inconsistencies that way, that they're also agreeing with the negatives. Again, we'll get more into this with the surveys, but it's a way to make sure people are reading. You might even have seen surveys where someone will say, for this statement, check strongly agree. Yeah. And then maybe later on, for this statement, check slightly disagree. And those are actually built-in checks so that if people don't check what you told them to, you can be pretty sure they aren't actually reading the questions and just going through the motions, maybe to get money, who knows. Well, that's it now for this part 1. So I'd say take a break, and then when you're ready, turn to part 2. Goodbye for now.